Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Happy New Year. I think it's still okay to say that in early February. And welcome to Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction's official podcast. I'm Razia Iqbal. The Baillie Gifford Prize celebrates the very best in non-fiction writing, from history and politics to nature and the arts. We're excited to be back for another year of fascinating debate and discussion. And as always, we are immensely grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous sponsorship, which makes this podcast possible. Our first episode of 2024 is dedicated to politics and democracy, because thanks to an alignment of calendars, 2024 is setting a record for the greatest number of people living in countries that will or already have held national elections. More than 4 billion people. That's just over half of humanity. Among those countries that will vote are the UK, the US, India, and countries in the European Union, which will elect the bloc's next parliament. So we wanted to convene a conversation about the challenges of thinking about and, of course, writing about 21st century elections. A big election year, more people voting in 2024 than in any previous year. But this great march to the ballot box doesn't necessarily mean an explosion of democracy, because we know there is more to democracy than voting. So lots to thrash out in the conversation. We're delighted to be joined by writer, journalist and former Baillie Gifford Prize judge, Samanth Subramanian, whose works include This Divided Island, Stories from the Sri Lankan War, and Following Fish, Travels Around the Indian Coast. We're also joined by Stephen Bush, associate editor and columnist at the Financial Times newspaper, who was also a prize judge in 2018. Welcome to you both, and thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start, first of all, with getting just a reflection from both of you about the kind of the aligning of this calendar and the significance that so many people are going to be focused on voting this year. Is it something that we feel now in the 21st century that matters to the people who are taking part, or does it tend to matter much more to the commentariat? Stephen Bush, let's start with you.
So I think it actually does matter quite a lot to the people taking part, not least because, so in some of these elections, the very fact that other people are watching will be a factor, right? That's one of the things that, Modi has very successfully done in the past, is treat his internal opponents when they complain about democratic backsliding, etc., as, voices of external opponents and people watching overseas. And because, of course, one of these elections is happening in the world's most powerful and important democracy, in many ways, in terms of the prosperity of the average person in the United Kingdom, the average person in the EU, whether or not Joe Biden defeats Donald Trump is a much more consequential election than whether or not, what form of majority you get in the European Parliament, or whether or not Keir Starmer defeats Rishi Sunak. And in an odd way, that's kind of always been the case as long as the global superpower has been a democracy. Kenneth Kaunda, a former president of Zambia, but at the time a leading member of their independence movement, talked about watching results from the 1945 general election in the UK and cheering every gain as if it had been for the UNIP, the Independence Party, because they believed that the Labour government would speed along the cause of independence. So I think it isn't just, obviously it's very exciting for commentators such as myself, but it is also a reflection of the fact that these elections have echoes well beyond their own shores.
Samanth, is that something that you reflect on when you observe, say, the United States? Obviously a really big year this year, but also India.
I think so. I often jokingly say every 4 years, I say to them, the results of the US election matter so much to the rest of us, influence the rest of our lives so much outside the US, that we should get like half a vote in deciding who becomes president of the United States. It's a joke, of course, but There's other things also that have become more and more interesting over the last decade, maybe, and that is the uniformity of the ways in which elections are run across the country, across the world. And so, if you go back to, for example, the question of a social media platform like Meta or Facebook, the ways in which parties use social media, use the power of information and misinformation, all of that is starting to align whether you're in a developing country or a first world country. Very often the people running these campaigns across these countries are the same. There are consulting firms that go out from territory to territory to sell their services to make sure that these social media campaigns are successful. So suddenly you have a kind of uniformity in the electoral process as well that you can discern in countries as varied as the United States and India.
It is really interesting. Last semester, I teach at Princeton University, and last semester I was teaching a course on disinformation and misinformation, and this semester I'm teaching a course on democracy. So it sort of feels to me that these things are so bound up with one another, and in this country, in at the moment, there does seem to be a real sense of fear on the part of those people who think that Trump poses a great threat to Biden in November this year. But also there is a sense that there might be malign forces, as we have seen in the past, intervening. I mean, Stephen, how much of this is an issue overall when it comes to the way political culture works now?
I think it's quite a big issue. I think partly because what we have seen over the past decade and will continue to see over the next is the erosion and, in some countries, the near total destruction of a local media scene, right? Elections in which many, many more people follow the news on global social media platforms, or they subscribe to global newspapers, such as ourselves at the FT, Bloomberg, New York Times, etc., etc. And given that and the decline of things like TV and public meetings, the ability of misinformation and outright disinformation to spread very freely on social media platforms, the most important ones, of course, being Facebook and WhatsApp, because they're the ones everyone uses, I think has become more important to how people feel about election outcomes. Because, of course, as you say, one of the things, yes, one part of democracy is elections taking place, but another part is losers accepting those results and feeling that the contest is fair. And of course, in many of the elections that we'll see this year won't be that fair. But in ones where it is, this rise of disinformation online is one of the reasons why people wrongly believe, for example, that Donald Trump did not lose the 2020 presidential election.
In India, Samanth, let's turn to India. The ruling BJP is, by the way, the world's biggest political party with more than 180 million members, and Narendra Modi has dominated the country and changed it, I think, profoundly over the 2 terms that he has been prime minister. I just wonder what you think about the level of participation in a country that has shifted so much. I mean, the people who criticize Modi will talk about how India is veering away from its secular constitution, that minorities, the largest, of course, being Muslims in India, are being discriminated against, that there is this kind of tenor and tone of the country that has moved away from being a secular country to one that is a Hindu nationalist country. I mean, I wonder about participation in that context, how much people feel that they genuinely have a voice.
Until now, at least, there haven't been extremely serious claims or allegations of actual electoral malpractice, which is something to be thankful for, although who knows how long that will continue. I do think people feel fairly represented at the ballot box. But if we go beyond the ballot box itself, beyond voting day, to sort of a deeper engagement with politics, there's an odd thing that's happened, which is one of Modi's successes. And you could say the same thing about Donald Trump and actually any populist leader around the world. But one of Modi's successes has been to sort of make politics a cultural thing. And that means that it extends beyond voting day into every single day, every single aspect of your life. It pervades your social media. It informs dinner table conversations when you meet family. It informs which friends you keep and which friends you don't. It informs how religious you look on the outside and how religious you feel on the inside. I mean, so all of this has really been perhaps a single most remarkable success. So to that extent, I think political engagement is really cultural engagement in India today. And if you want to measure that, I've never seen it, or now I've never experienced it be as deep and as widespread as it is today. Whether that's for the better or not is another matter altogether. But I think people are genuinely engaged, and I do think people think about this stuff all the time, which is not necessarily a great thing.
Let's just stay with you for a moment about the kind of fairness aspect of an election in the context of the domination of the kind of media that we see in India, that so much of independent voices have been sidelined, if not silenced, some would argue.
The thing that's happening is that while voting day itself may be relatively free and fair, the real work goes on in the 5 years between elections. And so that involves silencing your critics, that involves subverting the judicial process or the judiciary, that involves trying to put opposition political parties and their leaders on the back foot, or sometimes putting them into prison. That involves shutting down media voices that disagree with you or harassing journalists. So all of this work is actually happening in the 5 years leading up to the election itself, so that by the time the election rolls around, the BJP can be quite sure that they've laid the ground for the kind of thing they do really well, which is to go out there and win elections. And a lot of these wins are actually happening on the back of the work of the last 5 years.
Stephen Bush, I wonder, when you observe what's happening in the United States, it occurs to me that the kind of the grip that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party is curious for many, many reasons. But when I look at how much he has not just changed the political discourse, but there is very little reflection on the fact that he, apart from 2016, has not won elections for the GOP. You know, the 2018 midterms, he didn't do so well. 2020, of course, he lost, though he disputes it and continues to, and many millions in the country support him in that lie. And in some ways, it's important to say that it is a lie. And then again in 2022, the candidates that he backed did not do as well. The red wave didn't happen. And yet the grip he has on the party and the language that he uses to talk about being a winner is still so entrenched.
Yeah, it is really fascinating for precisely as you lay out, right? That even in 2016, when he won in the Electoral College, we have fairly robust polling evidence, and indeed fairly robust actual electoral evidence when you look at how Republicans as a whole did in that election, that Donald Trump is a net negative to the Republican Party. And although, of course, they got the very substantial victory of control of the Supreme Court, and through that, abortion law and a bunch of other consequential changes to American public policy, considering he did start with control of all three branches of government, it was not a very consequential presidency, and many of its quite few achievements, like Operation Warp Speed, were quite centrist stuff, right? And yet, the Republican Party has been completely unable to shake him off. Billions and billions of pounds have been spent by conservative donors to try. You know, they're kind of left either sort of publicly going, well, at least he's better than Biden, and in some cases privately saying, well, hopefully a second defeat will shake it off, or they're flirting with various third-party atoms. But yeah, I think the thing we know we don't yet know is what will happen to the Republican Party when Donald Trump either dies or becomes too physically, or becomes simply unwilling, I suppose, to keep running for office. Will it revert back to something different? Will it revert to the kind of Trump but more competent than DeSantis was trying and failing to sell? But the really interesting thing is the transformation he's wrought on the GOP, and then the fact that this is not an electorally lucrative transformation hasn't yet caused the party to try and move on, which is often usually what happens, of course, when a party loses an election. It goes, this sucks, let's try something else.
I wonder, Samanth, when you look at what's happening in the United States, what your reflections are in that context. You know, this idea that that the political culture is being led by the language that Trump uses, and how important that feels in terms of how it filters down to the way in which people engage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the nature of the political discourse that has changed. And it's, we could sort of do a PhD on whether Trump was the cause of it or a symptom of it or indeed an outcome of it, whether it changed earlier or whether the US and indeed other countries were primed to have their discourse shifted in this particular way. We talk very, very commonly these days about the polarization of the polity in all these countries that we're talking about today. And the shifting of the discourse is sort of one instance of it. And of course, there are forces on the right wing that are eager to capitalize on it. And Trump is the loudest person on the right wing who does that, but is not the only one. I mean, we see entire media networks like Fox News resorting to the same kind of exploitation of this discourse on the divide. And once that's set in, I mean, the depressing or bleak thing about it is it isn't possible necessarily to see how we can roll it back, how the genie goes back into the bottle. And I think this about India all the time, but of course I think it about the United States, is that once you've sort of let this toxin out, and this is the result of it, this divided polity, what makes people come together again? What sort of brings a certain measure of civility and thoughtfulness back to political discourse? And the answer is not obvious to any of us right now, I think.
In that context, the fact that the answer may not be obvious, I wonder how, given how high the stakes are in many countries this year, how is it possible for people like yourselves to keep your eye on the most important thing when you're writing and thinking about these high stakes? I mean, Stephen Bush, how, is it difficult or challenging to keep a sense of perspective and proportion when what you're seeing are just these kind of stark situations of polarization, and it's really important that you try and kind of keep some modicum of proportion here?
Yeah, I think it is difficult. I mean, I think it's difficult for two reasons. I think there's the personal vanity, and like many journalists, you desperately want to be talking about the thing which is driving the most conversation. And there are really important elections that don't involve Donald Trump in this over the course of this year. But that's all where you kind of want, I want to be on that one, because that's the one that loads of our readers will be talking about. But I think also the challenge is that the ideal election, I would say, is one in which, broadly speaking, both sides agree on what the problems are. They might have very radically different solutions and approaches, but they are clearly talking about a shared reality. It's not one in which you have to go, okay, well, how do we cover the fact that there is a conspiracy about Taylor Swift that has made it all the way into Fox News and into, formally respectful mainstream parts of American conservative thought. And there is, I think, a challenge between how do you cover that in a way where you correctly communicate that this is a mad theory. It is in of itself troubling that thought leaders, as it were, on the American right are talking about it, but you don't continually editorialize or blur the line between comment and news. And that is a real challenge. I think, a variety of media outlets are in different ways trying to explore how you do that while maintaining the important fundamentals of journalism.
I'm really interested in the kind of much broader nature of democracy. And I'm thinking now about the kind of protests and the demonstrations that have been happening in response to the war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. I wonder, Samanth, if you think about the whether what we're seeing is going to result in a kind of a shift, or has already resulted in a shift in terms of the way in which the global South is responding to the global North and the developed countries and their attitude to the war in the Middle East? I mean, is that something that feeds into the conventional stuff that we think about when we think about democracy, which is basically elections and people voting at the ballot box?
It's a big, complicated question. I mean, I think the protests themselves are remarkable because, like other protests before, and I'm thinking in particular of the climate protests over the last few years, I think these protests occur, and they occur at such scale because there's a distinct feeling that elected governments aren't really doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, which is to heed what their public wants and to act on it as policy. And I think the reason that these protests often manifest with such anger and desperation is because all over the world, I think governments have moved away from that, or at least there is a feeling that governments aren't doing that. And the Middle East, the protests about the war in the Middle East are actually off a piece with the climate protests in another way, which is that increasingly there is a sentiment in developing economies that Western societies and Western governments don't often live up to the ideals that they preach or sometimes inflict upon developing countries. This is nothing new. All of us know this as we read history. I mean, there's always sort of duplicity and self-interest at play here. But increasingly, the stakes are getting so much bigger. And countries like India, for example, I mean, India is a perfect example of how to play the self-interest game, knowing that the US or other Western democracies can be called out for the same thing. So to give you one example, when the war in Ukraine broke out, there was enormous pressure upon India to start boycotting Russian oil and gas imports. But what India actually did is double down on those imports because Russian oil and gas was getting cheap. And so they could afford more of it. And it really helps the cause of a developing economy to be able to buy cheap energy. And behind the scenes in negotiations with the US, the Indian government was able to impress on the US the fact that its own self-interest was at play here. And it was as important or as vital to it as the US's own self-interest. So I think and again, with the Middle East, we see the fact that the country that took Israel to the International Court of Justice was South Africa. It was backed by other Latin American countries. These are all countries that were in what used to formerly be called the Third World. And I think even that move at the international stage is evidence of the fact that governments in these countries think the US or the UK or European countries don't walk the walk, even though they talk the talk.
Stephen Bush, on the issue of kind of a single issue, a kind of campaigning thing that provokes people to go out and demonstrate in the streets, it's quite clear that there is passion. There's kind of a collective sense of feeling that people want to have their politician or their political leaders listen to them. I just wonder how it works the other way around. I mean, you understand political culture, particularly in the UK. I mean, politicians need not necessarily single messaging, but they need really powerful messaging, don't they, when they start campaigning? And we've seen with Rishi Sunak these kind of 5 goals that he continues to talk about. Doesn't matter what questions he's asked, he just goes back to those 5 points that he says that they're going to try and achieve. How difficult is that to kind of report on when you get very, very slick, trained politicians who are focusing on the message only?
Well, to be uncharitable, at the moment it helps, and in different ways. Neither of the major political parties in the UK are led by particularly natural politicians. But I think so. The really interesting thing about the intensification of these repeated messages, regardless of what the question is it is in part a reaction to how we in the media have changed, and indeed how consumption habits have changed, right? Then one of the reasons why they know they have to communicate in these very controlled, very repetitive ways is that they know they are mostly just being heard by absolutely nobody. You know, in 1992, which was an election the Labour Party thought they'd win and famously lost, which is therefore very much in the air in British politics at the moment, because we once again have these very large leads for the Labour Party, and people go, oh, well, could it happen again? In 1992, there was for an entire week a political argument that dominated the airwaves over one of Labour's party political broadcasts, these free guaranteed slots that parties get on broadcast media, in which they can go, look, here's our message. Now, my day job is covering British politics, and I couldn't tell you what the message of any of the big parties' last party political broadcasts were off the top of my head. So I think, in an odd way, the thing I always know is that the readers who are most, the readers who are most loyal, who we want to kind of keep with us, are the ones who will go, okay, but I've heard that already. What's the new story? So for us, I don't feel so much that there's a challenge to not just repeat these messages, but I do think that sometimes, and what's happened quite frequently in UK elections of late, is that the sort of official campaign as covered by political journalists becomes obsessed with small items of detail, very intricate political rows that are perhaps very enjoyable for readers of business newspapers, specialist magazines, and then maybe one or two of the broadsheets. And then the vast majority of people in the country are sort of left a bit cold by it. I'm thinking back to the 2015 TV debates, where the most Googled thing afterwards was, what is austerity? This word which had, from the perspective of people covering politics, defined British political debates for 5 years. And so I think in some ways the challenge for us is how we live in the world we've partly created.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting and very good point. I mean, I wonder, given everything that both of you have said, let's start with you, Samanth. I mean, do you feel optimistic about democracy? Do you feel that this year, which is going to see so many people going to the ballot box and engaging, or perhaps lots of people deciding that they're going to be apathetic? I mean, do you feel optimistic about the idea of democracy?
I feel pessimistic about the health of democracy, I can say that. And I don't necessarily mean that voting day, election day, goes peacefully. There's a free and fair election on the day itself. I mean, the kinds of things that contribute to a country being a democracy between elections, the institutions, civil society. I mean, the health of these things has corroded across the board, across the world. And I don't think we're going to recover that in one election cycle. I don't think we're going to recover that at the end of the election year. And I think that's something that profoundly depresses me sometimes. And of course, I'm looking with anxious eyes at a number of elections around the world, hoping that they don't go the way I fear they will.
Well, let's hear some of your predictions then.
In India, at least, the country I know best from a political standpoint, it looks very much as if the BJP will return to power. The only question is sort of how many seats they come back with, what kind of majority they get. But I think all the groundwork they've done over the last 5 years, the results of recent state elections, the results of polls and surveys, the health of the opposition, all of this makes me sort of quite certain of what the result is going to be.
And in the US, as you observe it?
I mean, it's been a while since I traveled there, and I think it's going to be much tighter than in India, certainly. It looks like the Democrats themselves are worried about this, and I think many people, even 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago, were concluding that Trump would be the Republican nominee, and that seems to be how it's going to pan out. And so, Trump versus Biden fight, with Biden having lost a certain measure of the liberal vote over his stance on Israel and Gaza, I do, again, it's going to be much closer than I would like it to be.
Stephen, before I get you to look at some predictions, I mean, I wonder about the extent to which you think people actually understand, say, for example, in the United States, that the election will be decided on the way in which voters in 5 or 6 swing states will cast their votes. And that for many people observing it, doesn't feel particularly democratic.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing which I always find a bit funny when people talk about the lessons that a party in another country can take from the last US political election, right? Or indeed any US political election, because they have this system that, well, actually, quite literally, in the founding document, it's not meant to be fair, right? It is meant to hold back certain features we would now regard as essential to a democracy. It does have what I would describe as an undemocratic, and also at the moment, as it happens, an anti-the Democratic Party tilt, although that may change in the future, as indeed in the past it has helped the Democratic Party and hurt the Republican Party. But it goes back to the sort of strangeness of this year. Then yes, elections do matter, and they are part of a democratic health check. But if you are a country like the United States, where broadly speaking, you have these very long lines to vote as a way of suppressing one side's voters, you have an electoral system which is insidiocratic, to put it mildly. Are you a proper democracy? I mean, I think if you were to try and introduce the Electoral College in France's presidential election, I was about to say they would riot. Obviously, they riot about quite a lot of things. But, they would riot even more than they did about pension changes, and rightly so. And so it is a slightly strange feature, and I think you're right, and people don't fully understand how odd it is, not least because people talk about, the median American is here, so why doesn't Biden say this? And you can tell them they haven't quite realised that the median American who matters in these elections is a median American in a handful of states who, for a variety of reasons, is not quite representative of the average American.
Are you pessimistic about the health of democracy in the way that Samanth just outlined?
Yes, I mean, history teaches us that democracy is very fragile, all right? It's the only system of government which has to permit the forces that would destroy it some level of purchase in the public sphere, right? Which means that at any given point, it's only ever one bad day, one bad candidate, one ill-chosen front page of the New York Times, etc., away from disaster. And I think we clearly are at a moment in global history when those vulnerabilities are particularly exposed, because across a large number of countries, France does have elections this year in the European Parliament, but its significant elections aren't this year. But France is another example, one where you have a choice between one candidate who, whatever you may think of whoever emerges as Macron's successor, as the standard bearer of that bit of politics, will be democratic, versus Le Pen and Rally, who are very much not democratic. And so, I do feel particularly worried and aware of democracy's fragility at the moment.
Let's get some predictions from you just to end, though. What do you think is going to happen, given everything that you said about the UK and 1992 and maybe the United States too?
So I am going to give a very spotty answer to this one, which is, I think that if you look at the underlying fundamentals in the United Kingdom, the condition of its economy, the pressures on public services, the large numbers of people sleeping rough, these are all indicators that would suggest we're going to have a change of government. So I think that is likely. And to look to the US for a moment, one of the reasons why I am more Panglossian either than I think everyone else on the FT editorial board, and perhaps even more worryingly, all of my family in the States think I'm wildly over-optimistic here. I think if you look at the condition of the American economy, and you look at the way the American consumer is behaving, and you look at how the Republican Party has performed in actual elections, so in special elections and in the midterms, I think that Joe Biden will just about hold off Donald Trump. But when you have a candidate like Donald Trump, who's, obviously particularly for all of us in Europe, whose victory would be consequential and not in a good way, even before you get to all of the stuff about, what he said about the last election, it is a bit scary to think, Joe Biden will probably have enough, because you'd hope that he would win that contest by loads. But I think Joe Biden will have enough to see off Donald Trump this time.
Stephen Bush, Samanth, Subramanian, thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for making the time to talk to us today. And we'd like once again to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its invaluable support for this podcast. Now, to find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and TikTok at BG Prize. Tune in next time to hear more from the world of literary non-fiction. Bye-bye for now.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.